This module will tie the Coso elements we've just discussed in the previous modules to the TRIO program itself. Now that we've covered all the basics of internal controls in Coso, let's tie it all together with the TRIO program. This module will cover how compliance categories of TRIO should be documented for the key internal controls in the Coso categories. TRIO requires the following categories to be addressed for compliance: general and overall controls, allowable cost, eligibility, equipment, matching, level of effort, procurement, reporting, and special tests. So let's take a look at the expected key controls for each. These are what we as auditors are looking for, and therefore it's critical to ensure your institution has the following controls in place. Just a quick note on the rest of the slides within this module. It is very detailed. We wanted to highlight that the key procedures and controls are listed on the left side, and then you'll notice all 5 of the Coso elements are listed across the top on the right-hand side. And essentially we're just tying in the key controls in each category to the required Coso elements, and therefore creating the full bridge between internal controls and your TRIO grant program. So let's just walk through the overall section on the next couple slides. So again, we're coming in and we're trying to get an understanding of who's doing what as it relates to the TRIO program. So we definitely want to have some time with the program director and other grant personnel in order to determine that they are knowledgeable of the grant requirements through either experience with the grant or attending trainings over the course of their career. We also want to note that the folks involved with TRIO have the resources they need available to meet the grant requirements. So having access to the grant agreements, regulations, handbooks, or any type of training or support that relates to the TRIO program. We also want to ensure that there's adequate segregation of duties as it relates to reviewing and authorization of TRIO costs. We also spend some time with purchasing, so we're looking at whether or not those responsibilities are separate from accounts payables and cash disbursements. And then again, we also want to look at written documents related to the ethics policies and the conflict of interest codes of conduct. Additionally, we'll look at the organizational level conflict of interest policy that is now required under uniform guidance. Ultimately, we want to ensure that there's a process in place to disclose in writing any potential conflict of interest to a federal awarding agency or pass-through entity. And finally, we want to ensure that there's ongoing monitoring built in through independent reconciliations related to the grant activity. Now, the next several slides relate to allowable costs, and there are quite a few, and that's because it's a key area as it represents how the grant funding is spent. So we'll look at the TRIO cost and to ensure that they are being charged consistently with policies and procedures, and that they're being charged between the direct and indirect methodology consistently. We also look at the key individual who is assigned to review the costs to ensure that they are in alignment with the TRIO program. There are also some specific items identified by the uniform guidance, referred to as the selected items of cost, Exhibit 1, and these are specific costs that the federal awarding agency has to approve in advance, so please familiarize yourself with those items. We also look at whether or not management is utilizing a budget, and specifically this budget would be the tool to monitor grant activities, determining whether or not total expenditures are exceeding the grant purpose, as well as that it's approved by the appropriate individual, and if required, would get prior approval from the federal awarding agency if there are significant budget changes. We also look at whether or not costs are consistently treated within the program and within the institution on how they are charged to different grant programs. We also look at whether or not costs are included as a cost to another federally financed program, either in the current or prior period. And we also have to look at, as auditors, of course, we're looking at whether or not the costs are adequately documented. For payroll, there are specific controls related to the tracking of labor costs for allowability. So we have specific controls that are to be addressed when we are looking at the salaries and wages that are charged to a federal program. And in general, the uniform guidance has implemented the following items in order to design the framework around accounting for labor cost. So the records that support payroll charges must be supported by the system of internal control to ensure that those charges are accurate, allowable, and properly allocated. The labor activity must be incorporated into official records, which just means within the payroll journal or the payroll support system. They must reasonably reflect the total activity for which the employee is compensated. So this is capturing 100% of an employee's time within the system. It should capture both the federal and non-federal components of the employee's time. And that the labor activity is complying with the established accounting policies and practices of the institution, and that there's support for the distribution of the salary between the different activities. So if you have somebody who charges 50% of their time to TRIO and 50% of their time to another grant, there's records to support that allocation. OMB also specifically added some criteria for institutions of higher education that are listed here. They just go into more specific details related to how departmental costs are charged for direct activities, and the same for general purpose equipment and how those are charged directly to a federal program. And then number 10 listed here, and this is something that may or may not be new to your organization, but we are now required to look at whether or not the organization has a policy on how allowable costs are determined within the system. We also look at whether or not there's a review of the expenditures charged to the TRIO program, including general journal entries. General journal entries posted to federal funds can be a risk area, so we pay particular attention to these manual adjustments, and we review for allowability, that the charges were incurred in the appropriate period, that they were reviewed and approved by the appropriate individual within the TRIO program, and that there's support for the charge that has been adjusted. We also have to look at whether or not any obligations that are incurred under the TRIO grant are liquidated or spent no later than 90 days after the end of the funding period, unless it's specifically allowed to be spent later than that. And then finally, within allowability is looking at indirect cost. So we'd look at the controls around how indirect costs are accumulated and allocated, whether it's through a cost allocation plan or an indirect cost rate, and that those determinations are approved and certified by the appropriate individual within the institution, monitored accordingly, and does not include costs that are directly charged to federal funds. Whew. So that was a lot of activity within allowable costs, as you can imagine. So moving on to cash management, or how the grant is funded through the drawdowns. So of course, we're back to, we like written documentation about everything, and so does the OMB. So we'd be looking at the written policy around managing cash as it relates to the TRIO program. We'd looked for the appropriate individual who would be assigned as the responsible person for approving the cash drawdowns, and that approval is documented. There's also a concept of certification of drawdown requests as well. And so we'd look at who is the person assigned to certify all of those vouchers. For reimbursement grants, we also have to look at whether or not there's a process in place to ensure that costs for which the reimbursement was requested were paid prior to the date of the reimbursement request. For advance funded grants, we just would look at the procedures related to drawing down those funds and how the institution has established a procedure to minimize the time elapsing between the drawdown and the disbursements. Again, also for advance funded grants only, whether or not the drawdown is deposited into a bank designated for the grant and identified as federal. Now looking at eligibility, so in my mind when I think of TRIO, the two most critical compliance categories are allowability of cost, but also eligibility, that the appropriate participants are receiving the benefit of the TRIO program. So when we look at eligibility, we're looking at who's assigned to approve whether or not the participant is an approved or qualified individual to receive the TRIO grant benefits. We also would like to look at documentation, the written documentation around how that determination is made and how that criteria is documented. Sometimes we see a checklist or some other process that's being utilized in order to make and document the eligibility determination. And then if there's periodic redeterminations or recertifications, we'd want to get our arms around who's in charge and how are those recertifications documented. And then finally, who is monitoring the eligible list of participants and keeping that up to date within the organization. For equipment, if TRIO funds are used to purchase equipment, we're looking at back to that assigned appropriate individual who is responsible for maintaining those records around the acquisitions and dispositions of property acquired with the TRIO funds. We look to see that those assets are included in the list and identified as purchased with federal funds, and that there's some sort of inventory of that equipment that has been conducted in the last 2 years in order to ensure the appropriate tracking of the federally funded equipment. On acquisitions, we want to make sure that they're property records that contain all of the required information around the purchase of the piece of equipment, and then on the disposition as well, that's been flagged as purchased with federal awards originally. Into the matching category, again, back to the appropriate individual who's responsible for monitoring and managing this compliance category. And you might find at your institution that you have one person who is the appropriate individual to monitor all of the compliance categories, and that can be documented and communicated to your auditors as well. But specifically to matching, we want to look at your documentation to support compliance with the matching requirement, and that you have practices in place to determine what the required amounts or limits for matching level of effort and earmarking are within the TRIO program. Purchasing had some more significant changes made to it through the implementation of uniform guidance. So we do spend a little bit of time looking at the procurement policies related to the institution on an overall basis and how it impacts the TRIO program. So we're looking at the documented policies and procedures, that there's a new requirement for the conflicts of interest related to purchasing activity and ensuring that that process has been documented as well. We also look for the specific procurement methods that are listed here and ensure that those are encompassed in your institution's procurement policy. The documentation should also include the items listed here about identifying the requirements for those that are bidding on a service or an item that will be charged to the grant, in addition to looking at whether or not the institution has conducted all of the procurement transactions within the manner of providing the full and open competition. Procurement documentation. Probably noticed our magic word for auditors is documentation, but we want to see when the decision's being made that there's documented basis for the contract selection, that the procurement was an open, full and open competition, that bids were solicited, if it meets the criteria, the dollar threshold, that there's a justification for lack of competition when competitive bids or offers are not obtained, and then the basis for awarding the contract itself. And then we'll also review the institution's procedures for verifying that a vendor is not debarred, suspended, or otherwise excluded. So we'd want to understand who at your institution is responsible for procurement and that they are provided or have access to the current list of parties excluded from federal procurement or non-procurement programs issued by the GSA. And finally, we want to understand who at the institution is responsible for monitoring and documenting the contractor's performance within the terms of the contract. For reporting, we typically want to understand, first of all, what kinds of reports are required by the program. So typically there's financial reports that are consistent with what's being requested for reimbursement, as well as on the performance side. And TRIO does have performance reporting requirements. So we're just looking for the process the institution takes on tracking when all of these reports are due and how are those monitored and reviewed by the appropriate individual, and that there's appropriate supporting accounting records that support the amounts and the criteria that's being reported. And then we also trace the amounts that are reported on the financial reports back to the accounting records that are then reported within the financial statements that are audited, as well as the federal grant audit, schedule of expenditures of federal awards. And then we do some testing for mathematical accuracy of the reports and supporting worksheets, as well as obtaining and reviewing the federal awarding agency's instructions for completing the reports. And then finally, the special test criteria for TRIO. We want to get our arms around that person who has been identified and is in charge of this area, and ensure that there are proper procedures in place to ensure that these special tests are being monitored and managed appropriately. And so we're looking to see if the organization collaborates with other TRIO projects, the Gear Up projects, or programs serving similar populations, and so forth. The program should keep records of any services that are provided to participants during the project period as well, in order to determine that you are in compliance with the special test. Well, that does it. That covers all the compliance categories. Thank you for listening, and this concludes the Coso Module 5.